Well, they are still counting votes in America, especially in California, where the deadline for mail-in ballots to arrive on time to be counted is tomorrow night. Ballots received in the mail tomorrow will be counted in California. So there are literally millions of ballots yet to be counted in this country, including in the state of Pennsylvania, where thousands of votes remain to be counted to determine the balance of the United States Senate. Republicans will probably have 52 senators next year, or 53 if Republicans win the Pennsylvania Senate election. The Democrats will probably have 47 members of the Senate, or 48 if Democrat Bob Casey wins the Pennsylvania Senate race. We still don't know which party will control the House of Representatives, but we do know that it will be very close. As of tonight, Republicans have 214 seats in the House and Democrats have 205 seats in the House, according to NBC News, with 16 remaining to be decided. In the presidential vote, Donald Trump currently has 50.2% of the vote to Kamala Harris's 48.1% of the vote. But that margin will probably narrow after all the California votes are finally counted. And it is possible that Kamala Harris will end up with only a 1% of the vote less than Donald Trump, a 1% gap. Right now, she's at 2% less than Donald Trump. If you hear anyone calling this election a landslide, please stop listening to that person about elections, at least. We have seen landslides in this country, and they don't look like this election. Bill Clinton's reelection was never in doubt in 1996. He won with 49.2% of the vote against Bob Dole's 40.7% of the vote and Ross Perot's 8.4% of the vote. Bill Clinton won by 9 points, and no one called that a landslide because it wasn't. The last landslide we had was Ronald Reagan's reelection in 1984, where he won 49 states in the Electoral College, with only the state of Minnesota voting for Walter Mondale, who was from Minnesota. Ronald Reagan beat Walter Mondale by 18 points. That's what a landslide looks like. There were two landslides before Reagan in the television age. Richard Nixon, in his reelection campaign in 1972, won 49 states with only Massachusetts voting against him. Nixon beat George McGovern by 23 points. But in both of those Republican landslides, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, the Democrats still easily controlled the House of Representatives. President Lyndon Johnson won a landslide victory in 1964 after the assassination of President Kennedy elevated Vice President Johnson to the presidency. In the 1964 election, the Democrats won 97 seats in the House, 97 more seats in the House, and they added 12 seats in the Senate. That's what they added to their margins. And no one thought that that was really remarkable, because the Democrats had been accustomed to having huge margins in the House and in the Senate, just huge margins. And as strong as Republicans, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, were in their presidential reelection campaigns, they couldn't come close to ever winning the House of Representatives for the Republicans. Tonight, Donald Trump is already chipping away at whatever the Republican count might end up being in the House of Representatives by choosing two newly reelected Republican members of the House to serve in his administration. The Trump ambassador to the United Nations will be Northern New York Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, a graduate of Harvard College who has much more foreign policy experience than Nikki Haley did when Donald Trump chose her as his first ambassador to the United Nations. Elise Stefanik has called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. She did oppose funding for Ukraine on the basis that the Biden administration had not done enough to secure the southern border, not on the actual situation Ukraine is facing. Elise Stefanik has said that Ukraine has a right to defend itself against Russian aggression. In other words, Elise Stefanik is not Marjorie Taylor Greene. She is as close to an establishment choice as is left in what has become the Republican Party. So, too, you might say, with Donald Trump's choice for National Security Advisor announced today, Florida Republican Congressman Mike Waltz. He's a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute. He's a former Green Beret who has served on the Armed Services Committee, Foreign Affairs Committee, and Intelligence Committee. He has, of course, been a Trump loyalist in the House of Representatives and said very stupid things in support of Donald Trump, as they all have. But he, too, is now about as close to a Republican establishment choice as is possible in what is left of the current Republican Party. Donald Trump's first choice of National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, survived exactly 2 weeks on the job before Donald Trump fired him under the heat of an FBI investigation about Flynn's possible illegal activity during the Trump transition in December of 2016. Last month, Michael Flynn said, when Donald Trump wins, quote, "Bar the door, believe me, the gates of hell, my hell, will be unleashed." Well, they won't be unleashed from the job of National Security Advisor. Michael Flynn's not getting his old job back, the one he lasted 2 weeks in. That's not happening. That's how much worse it could be. We're looking at the difficult frame of how bad can it be? It could be worse. Donald Trump's first choice of National Security Advisor 8 years ago was an unrestrained madman. And that is not the direction Donald Trump is going tonight. And it, of course, raises the question of who is making these decisions? Who is making what could be considered relatively safe choices for the Trump administration? Who decided, for example, to basically give Stephen Miller his old job back and nothing more? Stephen Miller's new title is going to be Deputy White House Chief of Staff in charge of domestic policy. That's basically what he was doing in the last Trump White House when he was called a senior advisor on domestic policy. It's not a Senate confirmation job. It's not a member of the cabinet. And so far, this looks like a Trump administration chosen by White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, a Republican establishment figure herself, who won her White House job by being Donald Trump's campaign manager. Donald Trump also announced, as Rachel and I were discussing, that Tom Homan will be a so-called border czar. We do not know what that means. If he had been chosen as Secretary of Homeland Security, we would know what that means, and he would have some real authority. Or if he was given his old job back as Director of the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement, we would know what that meant, and he would have some real authority. Apparently, someone else will get those jobs, the ones with real authority. It seems unlikely that the so-called border czar job, which Donald Trump is inventing, will require Senate confirmation. I mean, it certainly won't if he's just inventing that job. National Security Advisor job does not require Senate confirmation, but Ambassador to the United Nations does, as do all the other cabinet positions. And today, Donald Trump demanded that the United States Senate simply give up 235 years of history and constitutional duty by throwing away the confirmation process. Donald Trump seems to have a bunch of unconfirmable possible nominees in mind, so he told the United States Senate, quote, "Any Republican senator seeking the coveted leadership position in the United States Senate must agree to recess appointments in the Senate, exclamation point, without which we will not be able to get people confirmed in a timely manner. Sometimes the votes can take 2 years or more. This is what they did 4 years ago, and we cannot let it happen again. We need positions filed immediately." If Donald Trump tries to get Robert Kennedy Jr. confirmed by the Senate to any job, it would be possibly the ugliest confirmation hearing in history because of the number of people who have grievances against him, from women who have accused him of physical abuse to the mothers of possibly thousands of people who are dead because they followed Robert Kennedy Jr.'s poisonous medical advice. The confirmation hearing of Robert Kennedy Jr. would be a televised examination of a crazed incompetent. And that might just set the tone for a Trump administration. And so Donald Trump says, just throw away the Constitution and skip the Senate confirmation process. Never mind that many presidents have had dozens of members of their administration confirmed on the very first day of their presidencies. That's how Senate confirmation works when you don't nominate crazy people. There are 3 candidates for Majority Leader of the United States Senate. The front runner, as of today, was probably John Thune of South Dakota, followed by John Cornyn of Texas, with Florida's Rick Scott probably running third. But all of that could have changed when Rick Scott today immediately promised to obey Donald Trump and bypass the Senate confirmation process. The vote for Senate Majority Leader is done in secret within the Republican Party in a room where the door is closed, no one but Republican senators. We'll have more on the importance of that vote, which will occur tomorrow night, later in this program. It is now very clear that if White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles is going to try to run an orderly White House, her second biggest problem after Donald Trump is going to be Elon Musk. For the first time in history, during a phone call between a president-elect and the president of another country, a private citizen, rich businessman jumped on the call. Donald Trump handed the phone to Elon Musk during a call with Ukraine's President Zelensky. President Roosevelt never handed the phone to Henry Ford when he was talking to a foreign leader. Why couldn't Donald Trump get through that phone call on his own? Imagine if Joe Biden handed the phone to some private citizen during a presidential call with a head of state. Imagine the outrage we'd hear from the Trump-supporting media. If Elon Musk were taking it all seriously in the American business community, the stock market would have crashed when Elon Musk agreed that we should abolish the Federal Reserve. But because Wall Street has come to understand that Elon Musk is at least as clownish as Donald Trump, no one in the investing community actually thinks the Federal Reserve is threatened by a new Trump administration. Last week, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said no, he would not leave if Donald Trump tried to fire him. The president does not have the authority to fire the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who was appointed to a 5-year term. Jerome Powell was actually first appointed to the Federal Reserve by Donald Trump, of course, and then he was reappointed to another 5-year term by Joe Biden. Speaking of things the president cannot do, Donald Trump cannot withdraw the United States from the NATO alliance. NATO was formed by the North Atlantic Treaty, which was passed in the Senate in 1949. The House of Representatives does not vote on treaties. Like the confirmation process, the approval of treaties lies exclusively within the United States Senate. But removing the United States from NATO would now require a 2/3 vote by both the Senate and the House of Representatives, according to a new bipartisan law co-sponsored by Senator Marco Rubio, who is reported tonight to be Donald Trump's choice for Secretary of State in the coming Trump administration. That resolution, co-written by Marco Rubio, says the president shall not suspend, terminate, denounce, or withdraw the United States from the North Atlantic Treaty until such time as both the Senate and the House of Representatives pass by an affirmative vote of 2/3 of members a joint resolution approving the withdrawal of the United States from the treaty or pursuant to an act of Congress. The breaking news of the night, which should come as no surprise, is the New York Times reporting Susie Wiles, the next White House Chief of Staff, privately told a group of Republican donors on Monday that President-elect Donald J. Trump would move on his first day in office to reinstate several executive orders from Mr. Trump's first term that President Biden had revoked, according to 2 people in the room who insisted on anonymity to describe the closed-door remarks. Susie Wiles said something else in that room that is very true and should give important hope to Democrats. The New York Times reports Ms. Wiles emphasized to the group that the window for Mr. Trump to revolutionize government was more like 2 years rather than 4, it appeared to be an acknowledgement that most presidents face a difficult midterm election after 2 years in office. Leading off our discussion tonight is congressional historian Norm Ornstein. He is an emeritus scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Norm, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And I want to begin with a little bit of math here, since we don't quite know the outcome in the House or the Senate, in fact. But without knowing exactly how many Republican members of the House they have, Donald Trump has already picked off 2 of them, creating what will be 2 vacancies to start things off.
2 vacancies that would take 4 or 5 months, most likely, to be filled. And if it turns out that the House does have a Republican majority by 1 or 2, which is entirely possible, they could end up without a majority for several months. And if they don't have that majority, it means, certainly, among other things, that the ability of Trump to move as quickly as he can to secure all of those tax cuts that expire early next year and add on another $2 trillion in tax cuts, which he would try to do through the reconciliation process, needing only a majority in both houses. That's simply not going to happen. So there may be more House members who end up going. I'm not sure that Trump understood what he was doing when he made these choices, but it's going to create a very interesting and potentially quite delicious dynamic for the first few months of his term.
Yeah, I mean, I have to assume that Susie Wiles and company looked at the House and they are absolutely convinced that they're going to have control of it. But it doesn't look like the kind of control where you can afford to lose 2.
You know, even if we look at it in the last term, Lawrence, where the Republicans had a majority of 3 or 4, it didn't really work as a majority. And almost everything of significance that mattered, Mike Johnson, when he was Speaker, had to turn to Democrats to bail him out. And I suspect at this point, there are going to be a significant number of ultra-radical Freedom Caucus types who believe all the rhetoric, believe Elon Musk when he says we can cut $2 trillion from the budget and it won't take any heavy lifting. And that's not going to happen. And Mike Johnson's going to have to navigate through that if he is the Speaker. There's still a small possibility that Democrats will have a majority, and that would make an enormous difference in the dynamic going forward. But I have to add, Lawrence, based on your terrific monologue, what Donald Trump wants to do is to bypass the Congress as much as he possibly can, bypass them entirely if he can do so. The czars are going to be there so that they can tell cabinet members, assuming he gets them confirmed, Donald Trump wants this, and that's what you're going to do. And we also know that first executive order that Trump is likely to revoke and bring back what he put in place is that Schedule F, which would enable the president and, through him, his czars, RFK Jr. already saying apparently that he wants to fire 600 scientists at the National Institutes of Health to get rid of a lot of our experts. So the damage in the first 2 years could be dramatic, and especially if he goes in what is effectively a lawless and unconstitutional direction.
Norm, I wanted to go to this point that Susie Wiles made to those Republican contributors, that think of it as a 2-year presidency. And I first heard this, I'll never forget it. It was the first time I ever heard a conversation with a presidential candidate. It was actually, I worked for Senator Moynihan, and he was talking to someone who was going to run for president. And he said to him, well, you know, it's 18 months. It's the first 18 months, because after your first 18 months, you can't get anything done because everyone's running for re-election in the Congress and every vote becomes too risky. And then after that, you're a lame duck for or not, you know, depending on whether you can run for it. Trump, after these first 2 years, the first 18 months or so, becomes a lame duck.
That's certainly the case, assuming we still have our structures in place. Yeah. And I think he will get increasingly frustrated and try to do even more to keep those structures from impeding him or hurting him. But that's certainly the case. And we know that with this very narrow majority in the House, whichever direction it goes, you're going to have a sizable number of those House members who are going to be fearing the backlash. If Tom Homan working with Stephen Miller, does move forward with this drastic and dramatic deportation move, I think it's going to cause a firestorm out there. And remember, a lot of those people removed are doing jobs in places like in meatpacking plants in Nebraska or Iowa, where the industries are going to be suffering because nobody else will be there to fill them. And we're going to see, I think, some pressure from Republicans out there who believe the rhetoric but don't understand what it means when he tries to implement some of these changes.
Norm, we have some breaking news I need to get to here, but please stay with us because after that, we're going to squeeze in a commercial break. We do need to talk about Donald Trump trying to bypass the Senate confirmation process, and we need to talk about it with some detail. So we do have some breaking news. NBC News has just made another projection for the Democrats. They have picked up a seat in California's 27th congressional district, where a Democrat, George Whiteside, is beating Republican incumbent Mike Garcia. We'll be right back with more after this break. When the founders wrote the Constitution, they expected the Congress to be in recess for months at a time. In the first year of the first Congress, their very first recess was 3 months long. That was a typical recess. Reconvening Congress was difficult in those days, as the founders knew it would be. Traveling from Georgia to the first capital in New York City could take weeks, depending on how a representative or senator tried to cover that mileage. And so the Constitution included a provision for presidential appointments during a congressional recess, so that a new cabinet member who might have to take over from a dead cabinet member could quickly get to work. Alexander Hamilton made it very clear that recess appointments were supposed to be rare and only supposed to be used in an emergency, and that the Senate confirmation process was absolutely crucial to prevent the president from choosing people who would simply become, in Hamilton's words, the obsequious instruments of his pleasure. Yesterday, Donald Trump said he wants to bypass the Senate confirmation process by using recess appointments, which would require the United States Senate to immediately go into recess after Donald Trump was inaugurated for at least 10 days, so that Donald Trump could skip the confirmation process for as many of his nominees as he might choose. Still with us, Norm Ornstein. Norm, what do you make of Donald Trump's plan?
It's outrageous, but even more outrageous, Lawrence, is not just Rick Scott, but the other two nominees for Republican leader in the Senate hinted that they would go along, at least to some degree, with that as well. It is the core power of the Senate, and it's just mind-boggling to imagine that they would do this. Now, we know that, we've seen recess appointments in the past. We've even seen them for judges, and at least one instance for a period of time for a Supreme Court justice. But they were, as you say, rare and done usually with the agreement of both parties, or at least without a huge ruckus. The Supreme Court in 2014, when President Obama, dealing with Republicans in the Senate who were filibustering his nominees for the National Labor Relations Board, anti-union Republicans, Harry Reid, the leader, as I'm sure you remember, tried to use a brief recess where they had a pro forma session, and the court basically narrowed that focus some. I worry now that this Supreme Court will basically let Trump get away with this for a slew of nominees. And it is one of the most outrageous abrogations of power and irresponsible sets of actions, if it does happen, that I could imagine.
At the same time that Donald Trump was saying, skip the confirmation process for my people, in that same statement, he said that no judges should be approved during this time period between now and inauguration. And of course, there are judges ready to go. Chuck Schumer has judges, Biden nominees ready to be confirmed by the Senate. And we all know what happened at the end of the Trump presidency after the election, when Donald Trump got a Supreme Court justice confirmed at that time. And now Donald Trump is saying absolutely no one should be confirmed. And it's just another one of those proofs that Donald Trump can say anything, and his side of our politics doesn't hold him to account for anything he's ever said before that contradicts it.
You know, one of the other judges confirmed in that lame duck session before Trump left was Aileen Cannon, the same one who basically blew up what should have been a slam dunk prosecution in Florida for mishandling the most highly classified documents that we have. For Democrats now in the Senate, for Chuck Schumer and all the others, their job has to be to come back tomorrow and put through as many judgeships as there are vacancies now. They have the right and the responsibility to do it, and do it just the way that Donald Trump did. For Joe Biden, I should add, it's also making sure that Mr. Zelensky, Prime Minister Zelensky, has as much aid and as many weapons as we can get through during that time. Now, I'll say one other thing, Lawrence. Dick Durbin, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, has said, you know, we should bring back the blue slip, that process where a norm where the senators from a state can block a district court judge. It also sometimes applied to appeals court judges if it comes from their state. And we know that it's quite possible that if the Republicans get in and the blue slip still remains, and they will block a lot of those judges that Democrats want to get through now, and Biden does, the Republicans will blow it up in a nanosecond as soon as there's any resistance.
Yeah, they will. Norm Ornstein, thank you very much for joining us.
You bet. Thanks, Lawrence.
And coming up, Nevada's Democratic Senator Jackie Rosen won her re-election on Friday night. Senator Jackie Rosen joins us next. Friday night, enough votes were counted to project Nevada Democratic Senator Jackie Rosen as the winner in her re-election campaign for a second term in the United States Senate. On Saturday, Senator Rosen gave her victory speech at a Teamsters meeting hall in Las Vegas.
You know, my opponent spent more than $75 million against me to flip the seat. They spent tens of millions trying to tear me down, trying to tear us down, trying to lie about my record and turn me into something that I am not. But Nevadans saw the truth. Nevadans saw the truth. I am proud to be one of the most bipartisan, independent, and effective senators serving today. And I am not going to stop being that person who meets with everyone, who figures out what we need to do and what's best for our whole communities. That's not going to stop. And so no matter how anyone casts their vote this election, I represent all Nevadans, and I've shown that in my work. I pledge to continue that work, because winning elections isn't just about beating the other side. It's really about the progress that we can deliver. I'm not going to stop reaching across the aisle to find common ground, because my motto, as everyone knows, agree where you can and fight where you must. And so we're going to continue to work with who we can and stand up and fight where we must, because we have some big problems to solve. Climate change, immigration reform, gun violence, combating hate. We're going to have some challenges there. Combating hate of all kinds.
Joining our discussion now is Senator Jackie Rosen, Democrat of Nevada. Senator, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you for having me. I want to, it's Veterans Day today, and I want to thank all the veterans that may be watching and their families who sacrifice so much for our freedom. And we realize how precious democracy is as we're here to talk about the election. So thank you to our veterans today and their families.
Senator, it looks like you could be up against a situation on Trump nominees with Donald Trump today, actually yesterday, saying, let's just forget about the Senate confirmation process and just do recess appointments. This would require whoever the new Republican leader is to just put the Senate in recess for a couple of weeks as the first thing you do.
Well, I hope that it doesn't come to that, because I think it's important that the nominees go through regular order. We did that with our nominees, and we hope that they'll do the same, that they have a hearing, that we get to talk with them about how they'll act if they're lucky enough to be confirmed, and be able to question them. That is the Senate's role, in particular, as we confirm those nominees, is to go through regular order, go through the committee, go through the voting process, and I hope that we wouldn't circumvent that.
Senator, I think, there's a lot of people who are afraid out there tonight about things that could change affecting their lives, particularly on reproductive freedom, whether there could be a national abortion ban if Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the White House. What could you do to assure people that this will not be, that the rights they have will not be taken away by this new Congress?
Well, I can tell you that we will use every tool in the toolbox that we have to protect women's reproductive freedoms, to keep our families safe, to protect our civil rights. And I will tell you in particular, when it comes to women, we look at these laws around the country where 1/3 of American women don't have access to care, and they literally are dying. Preventable deaths in hospital emergency rooms and in hospital beds as we speak. And so we have to try to find every single way that we can to push back on this. And when we go back to Washington tomorrow, these will be some of the things that we speak about together. What are the tools that we have within the Senate, within the House and Congress, the legal tools within our states, and how do we move forward? Because we can't allow any more women dying.
Senator, you know that the first question your colleagues, your Democratic colleagues, are going to have for you back in the Senate is, how did you do it? And was there one particular thing that you did differently from other Democrats trying to win re-election who couldn't quite do it?
Well, I can tell you that all of my colleagues, they all ran tremendous races, and everybody worked so very hard. Here, the race for me in Nevada was about me versus Sam Brown. Sam Brown was a failed politician who moved here to Nevada just a few years ago to run for United States Senate, lost in the primary last cycle. And so I think that people in Nevada knew me, knew of my record delivering for Nevada, being one of the most bipartisan, effective, and independent senators. Nevada's been my home for about 50 years. And how we talked about what we wanted for Nevada, that was really important, and I think that's what put me over the edge.
Senator Jackie Rosen, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Coming up, we know one thing Donald Trump will do on day one, and that is take credit for the economy Joe Biden has built and is handing to him. The economy is probably going to be very good next year, and we can count on most of the news media to forget why. That's next. Donald Trump is going to inherit the best economy in the world, thanks to Joe Biden. Starting in January, Donald Trump will begin calling the American economy the best economy in the world after lying about it for the last 4 years. Donald Trump will no doubt claim that everything is better in the economy next year simply because he was elected president. The American news media will face a challenge that it is likely to mostly fail, which is remembering how much Joe Biden did to build this economy. Conservative economist Oren Cass writes in the New York Times, real investment in factories has more than doubled since President Biden took office. For the electronics industry, it has nearly quadrupled since the beginning of 2022. By comparison, Mr. Trump's Council of Economic Advisors tried to show that his 2017 tax cut spurred investment, but instead found an effect of zero. Joining our discussion now is Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, Senior Associate Dean at the Yale School of Management and a CNBC contributor. Jeff, just looking at the numbers, there's so much that Joe Biden built into this economy that I cannot retain it all at once. Whenever I read your article today, I read other pieces, it reminds me of pieces I've forgotten. And that's what the politics of this is going to be next year, is going to be the challenge of reminding people how we got here.
Can you imagine being Joe Biden? You and I have very strong feelings about the success of this president's administration Some people have some differences, but this has been one unlucky guy. I stuffed envelopes for him in 1972 for when he lost his wife and daughter and got elected to the Senate. And then, of course, losing his treasured son and losing, going on the debate stage, getting COVID, which finally was diagnosed, like I said he had, and they didn't want to admit it, into the debate. And now we have this, where he's built such an incredible machine that's going to be inherited by somebody else. What did Trump keep?
Lowest, I was looking at it today. I hadn't looked at this before. Lowest unemployment number of any president running for re-election. And as far back as we can remember.
We haven't had unemployment this low since Bonanza was the #1 show on TV, and at least you and I remember that show. It was 1968. We haven't had unemployment this low. It was a little bit above that when Trump was president, but it's better now. Trump says he ruined the economy. Trump's best year, 2019, before COVID hit, the unemployment was a little higher than it is now. Biden's is much better, and inflation was about where it is now. So he said, these are the finest times ever. Well, we've returned then to those finest times. But what was the hand that Biden was dealt by Trump was an economy that ground to a halt, the worst post-war recession ever that we had since the end of the Second World War. And of course, prices were low. You couldn't give oil away. It was negatively priced. And so we had, and I think the Federal Reserve tried to do what they could. They get too much credit for it. It was working through supply chain issues from the mishandled COVID crisis from Trump. So you don't have 140 ships now out in the Los Angeles harbor anymore, waiting weeks and weeks to get in. And we had to work through the supply chain issues. And but it's remarkable. We have anything good that Trump had before COVID. Biden has more than beaten that now. But he also has cut the deficit. He's cut it by a third. It tripled. He cut it by 2/3. It tripled. Under Trump, which is amazing. And these tax cuts he's talking about for the wealthy are only going to hike it up more. But what you opened with is the big thing. And that's what we heard President Biden talk about yesterday. It was just painful to hear, wistfully, saying, I've got, over $1 trillion of infrastructure investment that's going to lead to 15 million more jobs. By the way, Biden has already created 16 million jobs. Trump lost 500,000 jobs when he took over, and he lost 500,000 auto jobs, rather. It was disastrous. And so what we see is a lot's going to roll out. Unfortunately, Treasury was slow in clearing a lot of projects. So the timeline is going to unfold. And the CHIPS Act, a lot of jobs will come out of that. And
there'll be a lot of ribbon cuttings, and Donald Trump will probably start at 10.
Oh, it'll be 50,000 jobs.
We're going to leave it there for tonight, but we have to police this issue going into the next year.
Absolutely.
Jeff Sonnenfeld, thank you very much for joining us tonight. That is tonight's last word.